Hello everyone, my name is Luis Aguilar, and in this video we're going to cover local and global variables. At this point you may be very familiar with variables, so this video is going to talk about two types of variables that are very important to know when starting a program. So let's get started. So you may be asking yourself, well, what's the difference between a local and a global variable? Well, for starters, local variables. These are what you're most likely used to using and seeing. Local variables are defined in a function. The thing you may not understand is that those variables are only available in that function. And global variables. These are variables that are set up similar to local variables. However, global variables are defined outside all functions and are available to all functions within its scope. So these are some basic definitions of these two concepts, but don't worry, we'll be talking about them deeper within this video. And starting off with local variables. Some good things to know about local variables is that local variables are local to the function that they are created in. So with that in mind, this means that those variables are basically hidden from other functions you may have. Also, this means that different functions are allowed to have variables with the same name. And lastly, local variables only exist during the execution of that function. So any variables that contain values will be lost between function calls, in respect to which the variable was declared. Now another thing about local variables is, let's talk static local variables. So remember that local variables are not persisted between function calls. So this basically means that once a function is finished, the variables are then destroyed and then recreated when a function is called again. So this is when static local variables can come into play. So basically, static local variables are not destroyed when a function is finished executing and returns back, right? In our upcoming demos, we'll be showcasing this more in depth, but for now, let's move on. So global variables. So global variables, remember, they are defined outside all functions. The scope is basically from the global variable definition to the end. And the global variable is accessible in all functions after the definition. However, there are a few things to note. It is heavily advised to try and restrict the use of global variables. Why, you may ask? Well, for a few reasons. First, they kind of complicate any debugging process that you may have, right? Keep in mind that any function will be able to access these variables, global variables in respect. So if you have multiple functions accessing one global variable, you may not be able to get your desired outcome, and you will need to thoroughly look at your code to find any issues. Second, it kind of complicates programs, and that's the last thing any programmer wants to do. You will need to keep track of what each function does to your global variable, since each function will have access to it. And third, it kind of complicates functions as well. So creating functions, if you create a function that's dependent on global variables, this hinders you, because if you would want to reuse code, you would have to sort of refactor it, so that way those functions are not dependent on those global variables. So let's talk about global constants really quick, right? So we said before that to try to restrict the use of global variables as much as we can, but there may be times where we may want to use global variables, right? And this is where global constants can come into play. Now, for the most part, global constants are okay to use in regards to the program you may be writing, right? And this is because when using the keyword constant in front of your global variables, this means that the value cannot be changed throughout the program, right? Whatever you initialize it to, that is what it will be for the rest of the program, and you cannot change it. So this eliminates the need of worrying about it being manipulated if you're going to be accessing it throughout many functions throughout your program, right? And so global constants can be needed if you have an unchanged value that will be needed throughout the program, right? And this could be very situational, right? A few examples are any banking programs you may be using. If you are working with interest rates and you have a fixed interest rate, you maybe want a global constant variable that you may be used throughout the program that may be accessed by various functions, since you will be using a fixed interest rate, right? Payroll, if you're working with anything monetary, let's say you have a fixed salary for a certain group or whatever, you may use that throughout the program as well. Another thing may be educational purposes. Let's say you have a global constant variable that holds a certain class, and you know that class is going to be used throughout the program. You could do that as well. So now, after talking about local variables, static local variables, global variables, and global constants, let's move on to our demos. So in our first demo here, we're going to showcase local functions in its basic form. So this program is very similar to what you guys may be familiar with already, but just for showcasing purposes, let's run the program right now and see what happens. So I already have my program saved and compiled, so all we need to do is run it. So let's go down the code while we explain the output, right? So here in main, we see we have a few prompts to say that we're in main and to point out what our variable number contains, right? So see, we printed out that we are in main, so right here, and then main number is 1. Great, this is perfectly fine. Int number 1 is local in main, so this is perfect. And then you see on line 13, we have our function call. So then we go into our function here, right? Starting on line 20. And then as you can see here, we are in func. We are now in func. Great. We say that we're going to be changing the value to 2021, right? And you can see on line 22, we have a local variable within our function called number. It has the same name, but we see we initialize it to 2021, hence the prompt here. And then on line 26, we see that, once again, just for to show us where we are in the program and what's happening. So function func number is this variable, and then we see on the output, it see that we are in 2021, and then now we are leaving func. So now that this function has finished executing, we are then transported back in main, and then line 15 executes where it says that we are returned to main, and number is still 1. So you see, this showcases that we have two variables of the same name. Each variable has different value initializations, and as you can see, when in func, the value is 2021, and in main function, the number is 1, right? And none of this change even when we change it here in our function. So this is sort of like bare bones explanation. So let's try to change this up a little bit, right? So now we're going to change the local variable to a global variable. So first we could do that by cutting this here and just pasting it up here. And I'm gonna put mine right under our function prototype, but you could put it before if you like. It's just preference, right? So I'm gonna put it under function prototype, right? So this is now our global variable. Okay, so that's not our global variable, so this should be fine. This is fine. Okay, now let's go down to func, right? So for demo purposes, if I were to leave this integer like this, the compiler will see this as a local variable to func, and thus when it outputs, this number would stay 1, as in right here, because the compiler sees this as a local variable to this function, right? So in order to avoid that, I'm just going to delete this, and then great. Now that that's taken care of, we have one variable, which is our global variable, and so two functions should be accessing this one global variable. So now that we have that set up and ready to go, let's save it, right? So let's save that. Now let's compile it and let's run it. Great. So now that you see here, we are in main. Yep, we're in main. Main number is 1, so great, since we initialized our global variable to 1. This is 1, so that's fine. And now we're in func, right? We go to func, we go here, and we see that we now change the value in our global variable number to 2021. So it says here we are in func. We're going to change the value to 2021. Function func number is 2021. Great. So now we're going to leaving func. So now this function has finished executing. So now we're back on line 15. Line 15 executes. Return to main. Global variable number is what we want, and as we see that it is actually 2021. So we see that our global variable number is changed within our function, and then obviously it affects this variable everywhere in the program, right? And as we can see in main function, the variable value has changed. So in this next demo, we're going to showcase the concept of static local variables. First, let's see what happens when we change the local variable within a function. Here we also have a basic program, and we see in main that we have two function calls on line 8 and on line 10. And within our function, we have a simple output to show what the value is. We then have a prompt to tell us that we are going to change the value to 2021. And we see that on line 24, we change the value and then exit the function back to main. So let's see this in action. Great. So we see here that our first line executes while in main, line 8, our first function call. We are in func. We have our local variable number 5 initialized to 5, right? We prompt it out. We then say that we're going to change the value in our variable to 2021, and then we see here on line 24 that we actually do that, right? And then we return back to main. Line 9 executes, and then we know that we are back in main, that we're going to call function func again. And then once we're back in function func, we see that the number is still 5, right? The variable never changes. Remember, this happens because the local variable number is destroyed when the function is done. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, what happens when we want the program to remember our change variable, right? And that'll be showcased in our last demo of this video. In our last demo of this video, we're going to showcase the keyword static when applying it on a local variable, right? So here we have a similar setup, but we see that we have our function call inside a for loop. We're going to call this function 5 times for the purpose of this demo. When we look at our function, our local variable has the keyword static. That means the value in our static local variable will not be destroyed when the function is finished executing. The lifetime of this variable lasts as long as the program lasts. So with that being said, let's run the program and see what happens. We see here that the for loop is indeed working, right? It says here we are in func, function calls, right? The function is called, we go to func, right? Our value is initialized, and we see that we start at 0, and then we have a prompt that says we're going to increment it, and on line 23 we increment, and then we finish, right? The function finished executing, and then we're taking back up into the for loop, right? I is incremented again, so now I is now 1, and then we call func again, and we call func again. But then take notice, when we return back into our function, right, we see that it is actually incremented. There's no variable here. Our number variable isn't here. The only variable that we have is in our function, and as you can see, it saves the value, right? It remembers it, and that we see that happening all throughout the for loop, so which would be 5 times. Now you might have noticed that while we never initialize the static variable to 0, it is set by default. So this is the same with global variables as well. They are set to 0 by default if you don't initialize them. Also, you may be asking why the variable is not initialized to 0 when the function is called again throughout the loop. Keep in mind that static local variables are only created once. So initializing to 0 only happens once. So this line right here, right, the compiler sees that it's static and it is created, and its lifetime lasts as long as the program lasts. So this is never destroyed like in our previous demo when the variable is destroyed when the function finished executing. So this prevents the variable from being destroyed, and it remembers what value it had before, which is why we have this here. So this is the last of our demo. We went over the concepts of local and global variables, and we went over a few demos as well to showcase some of these concepts. I hope this video taught you important concepts that will help you in your future projects throughout your college classes. And I want to thank you all for watching, and I hope you all have a good day. Thank you.